robots and algorithm, and in a very also concrete way. I will call Reginald Shua. You know him, he's the Chief Operating Officer in Reuters. Please come and present your panel. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. So for those of you who were in Lisbon last year, this might seem like a really familiar panel because we were on stage, the three of us, and we did, I think, pretty much exactly the same thing. The difference was Ben was moderating that time, so I'm doing it this year, and then of course if we do it again next year, Lisa will get the mic. So we did such a good job, they wanted us back again, so here we are. A really quick introduction. I'm Reg, I'm from Reuters. This is Ben, he's from Microsoft. This is Lisa, she's from the AP. And if you want, you can look up last year's website and you can see what we did then. You might ask, why are we here again, talking about the same thing? And I think one of the reasons is that, the field really moves very quickly. We're all sort of, there have been multiple panels on AI here. Everyone's sort of touching a little bit of this big beast. I think we're all just struggling to keep up, frankly, with what the capabilities are, but not only that, it's how newsrooms can adapt to this, how we can organize around it, and how we can use it effectively. So I thought it'd be a chance for us to talk a little bit about how AI is affecting news creation, distribution, the product, and frankly, how it fits into the workflow and the organization of a newsroom. So let's just start a bit by sort of laying the table on where we think we are in terms of how AI capability has come along, frankly, in the last 12 months. I mean, Lisa, do you want to talk a little bit about what you see out there?
Well, I mean, I can say from the perspective of Associated Press, when we started using these technologies almost 5 years ago now, of course, very new, we were learning, and it was really about, for us, solving problems of efficiency. How are we going to save journalists time and use our resources more efficiently? And I think, as you've said, like we've all kind of become familiar with that sort of narrative. Oh, let's remove routine tasks from journalists' work. Let's save time. It doesn't eliminate jobs. It changes jobs. And I think as we've gotten more experience with these technologies and the technologies have evolved, the challenges have become, a little bit more sophisticated. And it's about both how do we actually inform the work of beat reporters, moving beyond just the efficiencies of a news organization to how can individual journalists use these technologies and tools for their work. And when we talk about how will journalists work with robots, we're talking both about how news organizations like ours adapt these technologies into the workflows, and also how individual journalists, can use them in their reporting and to do their jobs. And as we were talking in preparation for this panel, I mean, I think that area of news gathering, how beat reporters will be using algorithms to find news about their beat and learn new things about their beat. I think those are really prime areas of exploration that we're just beginning to discover.
Ben, you guys make this stuff. Tell me what's moved in the last year or so.
Sure. The biggest shift that I've seen, like when we talked last year, we were talking at a very theoretical level about the role that AI can play in both like the journalistic process, kind of before a story is created, and then in the presentation of that story, and how we pioneer new mediums to tell the stories in more compelling and relevant ways. The thing that I've seen over the last 12 months is this really steep hockey sticking up in terms of the democratization of the tools. I think not just us, but other players in the industry have really thought about how you can take these things. Traditionally, you needed a PhD level data scientist, you needed a full stack developer, you needed a front end developer, you needed somebody who knew, for example, like how to work in Azure and really build the complex systems that rig everything together to effectively drag and drop tools that any journalist of any level can really start putting into play. So it's kind of moved beyond the spot where only a Reuters or an AP or a BBC or a CNN of somebody of that magnitude that has the people and the financial resources. Now it's at the spot where local journalists really can go to the web, take some short training on how to use the services and start deploying it to tell more impactful stories.
Yeah, in fact, and we'll come back to that in a second. I just want to talk through a couple other points. But one of the examples was Lisa and I were both at an offsite, and we're talking to the guy from Quartz who, before breakfast, sat down and had gotten 183 flight paths of New York Police Department helicopters and encoded a machine learning algorithm that would detect whenever a helicopter was hovering and then alert him. And literally in an hour in the morning, he managed to get that to run at, I think, 90% accuracy, which is pretty damn impressive.
Yeah, and that's like those kinds of tools. When I say off the shelf, I think about things like if you wanted to do, if you saw my workshop yesterday, we were talking about, or on Thursday, I should say, we were talking about identifying people in videos. And that was the kind of thing where if I wanted to train a model a year ago, 2 years ago, that was a complex process. Now I upload a few photos of myself into my model that is locked into my instance. I rerun my video, and it identifies me in all my videos. So it's really as simple as just uploading some photos, and you can just get to work, which is a really powerful tool for a journalist of any level.
And people here have talked about all of the other things we can do, right? I mean, so for example, Trin had come in and talked about how you could do transcriptions automatically. So there are all of these tools that really kind of help efficiency. Bloomberg talked about finding insight in stories. Lisa, can you talk a little bit about how beyond sort of helping us do our work better, either more efficiently or with more insight, how that might actually change what we actually deliver to people, just beyond just kind of the news as we currently create it?
Well, I mean, one of the things we've talked about is how these technologies can help us create different versions of stories for multiple platforms that, once you kind of work some efficiencies into your existing workflow and help get your existing content out, now you can start to think about, well, what else might we offer? One of the things AP is working on is a summarization tool. Can we use natural language processing to automatically generate a summary of every single AP text story that's written to be read? And the summary, the robot can produce a summary that's meant to be spoken. And so, if we can use algorithms to produce that, then what's the next step in terms of producing the 100-word story along with the 500-word story and the bullet point version along with the narrative version? And I mean, that's just one example of, I think, how we're getting to the point where we can really start thinking about content strategy in a very strategic way.
And what's the journalist's role there then? If a machine is basically writing most of the, let's say there's 50 versions of a story, what's the role of the journalist? Because the journalist has traditionally thought of him or herself as the narrative builder as opposed to the fact gatherer, and this seems to change the job significantly.
Yeah, I mean, in our case, we have it built into this workflow that editors will still approve the summaries before publication, and generally we have that philosophy that even if the content is automatically generated, it will not be automatically published. But I think, the larger question that you're getting at, is something John Micklethwaite referred to yesterday. If algorithms are detecting patterns and insights from data more quickly, then the editor's role and being able to say to the reporter, well, hey, why did you choose not to write about this, or should we write about this? I mean, it does start to change that relationship between the editor and the reporter now that you have this additional tool involved in fact-finding.
I didn't attend Amy Webb's session yesterday because I didn't arrive in time the day before, but I gather she talked a bit about different personas that could be created and how you could use AI for good. Krishna Bharat was talking about the Google voice experiment where they got a machine to call the hairdresser. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we could be doing is we'd be having much more interactive voice news, right? Tell me what happened. There was a fire. Oh, did anybody get hurt? Oh, 3 people were injured, and so on. And I know you guys have essentially much the same technology, or better, presumably. how close are we to being able to really kind of encode that kind of news? Just the, tell me what happened, and then truly, genuinely have this, not a pre-coded chatbot, but really a truly interactive experience with a machine.
I think it depends on the breadth of experience that you're trying to deliver. If I was trying to, because when you start thinking about the different permutations of what those conversations can be, map that against a knowledge graph against everything that's happening in every region, on every topic around the world, you get to an extraordinarily large amount of data very, very quickly. So I think probably the next phase will be depth experiences around specific verticals or specific topics. Sport.
Well, for example, let's say sport. I mean, how hard would it be today? I mean, there's a ton of data around sports. Presumably, a journalist could collect quotes and add, some particularly insightful parts. Although, again, if you've looked at things like narrative science, they have a strong machine understanding of what happened in the game. So, with all of that today, how hard would it be to build a, hey, tell me how the game yesterday went, and just have that whole conversation?
Yeah, if you're talking at something at, I'd say, like a cursory level, which is like, hey, my favorite team is Liverpool, and I want to know everything there is to know about Liverpool. Tell me what happened in the match yesterday, who scored the goals, when's the last time that number of goals was scored. That's fairly easy to do. We could actually do that today. Because you've got a fairly, like a bounded knowledge graph, right? I know we're talking about English Premier League soccer. I know that this is my team. I know who scored the goals. I have all the historical records of fairly structured data. When you start to kind of get beyond that, and you start asking more generic questions, the way people tend to want to receive the news, what happened in the world of sport today? That's a very complex question. Now I have to know what factually happened. I have to know something about you as the asker, me as the person who's asking the question, what sports I prefer, what region I'm in, what languages I speak, what teams I like. Because if I'm a boxing fan and I say what happened in the world of sport today, and it says here's the latest scores at the Masters, I'm going to be disappointed, and then I'm going to have to say no, stupid bot. I want to know about what happened in boxing this weekend. And it goes, oh, okay, cool, I'll flip you over to boxing. And it starts to break the natural flow of the conversation, which is so critical. What we've been working on is we have a really interesting technology called Zhao-Ice that has both an IQ component, which is like I know empirically what's happened, but also an EQ component. So it has a much more natural way of interacting. That's where the conversational bots start to get really interesting, where it can respond to my mood, it can respond to my personality, and it can respond to the things that I'm interested in. So I think that you're going to start to see first is these depth, rather than large breadths of conversation, specific experiences that I would say are like the inch wide and a mile deep, and then gradually we'll move to 6 inches and then to a foot and then to a yard and beyond that.
So Reg, you don't just get to ask questions. I would like you to answer one. I mean,
You're practicing for next year's moderation already.
It's a good warm-up for next year.
You have talked for a while about how this changes the definition of the story. So, I mean, I wonder how you would answer this question about, the role of the journalist and what we think of as the story.
Well, so, I think that the idea obviously is that we should do multiple versions of stories, right? I mean, there is, I still remember a really interesting discussion from the head of narrative science who said, we could do, at one point we programmed a baseball story that had lots of suspense in it, right? It was the top of the 9th inning, and everybody said, no, I want to know who wins, right? Now, the point was, though, is that most sports fans want to know who wins, but some people want suspense. So why not have 2 versions, right? There's a version, you could do, I mean, this takes us all down into lots of sort of rabbit holes. But, you could have a version of a story that really does concentrate on your favorite player. You could have a version of a story that concentrates on your portfolio. You could have a short version of a story when you're on the move, and a long version of a story when you're standing still, because if you have this, you know exactly how fast you're moving and what you're doing at the time. That's just versioning, and machines can help with that. But I think the chatbot issue, or not the chatbot, I guess the interactive voice thing really changes it, because to some extent you don't write anything at all. And I think that changes the whole definition of a journalist's job in a very interesting way, because what it means is then we collect facts, less story, and less storytelling. I mean, I think you'd still build a narrative arc. And you clearly, for sort of big investigative projects, you'd still want to do those sorts of things where you tell a story in a way that is compelling and gets people interested. But for a lot of other stuff, your job becomes get facts, and that's a big mental cultural shift for all of us, I think.
Yeah, I think those bots that you talked about, I mean, they could be a very powerful research assistant as well.
Yes.
Because when I map those, when I start to think about what I would need to do as an individual human to manually read through and find individual facts and say the entire Reuters archive, the entire AP archive, you're talking about petabytes of data. But using like cognitive search capabilities where I can index that data, where I can find the entities, I understand the relationships, and now I don't even need to really know how to use the tool. I can ask my Reuters assistant or my AP assistant and say, hey, I'm researching a story on blah. I'm thinking about these 3 things. Tell me how they're related. And it can start to give me intelligent recommendations, not to replace my role as a storyteller, as a fact checker, but to start to say, these are the kinds of things that you should explore. These are the things that you just asked about. Based on what you just asked about, I've also discovered these other things that you should start to take a look at. It starts to radically scale what a...
But frankly, if you can do that, why isn't that a product? You know, why keep it in the newsroom? Why not sell it outside, in fact?
Well, again, you're starting to talk about like what the knowledge graph looks like. To do that across the entirety of human knowledge gets very, very complex.
Well, I meant selling the AP
but
archive
I'm talking about this
way,
as a theoretical experiment. Like, why wouldn't we make this product? Because it's a lot of, as humanity, we've done a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of data in there. But you also start to open up a really interesting thing when you talk about news organizations like your news organizations, everybody in this room, which is some of the world's best reporting, some of the world's most important reporting, not just happening now, but historically over the last 20, 50, 100, 200 years, in some cases literally locked in the basement of a building in London or Paris or New York or wherever. We know the information is there, but we can't get to it. And you start to get to a really interesting revenue model. If I say, well, maybe the ad model isn't working the way that I want it to work, I'm not driving as much revenue as I want, I want to start to open up new reasons for somebody to want to subscribe and pay for my content, because that allows me to reinvest and create more content. Is that a member subscriber benefit where you can read the news and then there is an adjacent experience? It's like, do you want to explore the historical context of that news? Right. That gets to be a really powerful tool. Like, you can start to expose things that most people who visit the AP or visit Reuters or the BBC or wherever else would never ever be exposed to, and that's where algorithms can really help and really create a more valuable experience from a business perspective.
And I think a key part of that is really the fact that you don't need to present, if I say, tell me the history of this story, I don't really want to read 200 stories about that, most of which are incrementally different. What I want is I want it to be nicely summarized and pulled together.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I'd love to stay a little bit with this idea of the AI assistant for journalists, because essentially, I mean, I think that, and that's something I'm working a lot on this year, or at least thinking about it. When you think about a beat, a journalist covering a beat, whether it's healthcare or the economy or, technology, let's say the amount of time they have to spend just reading in on, hey, what happened while I was sleeping, or what are all of the analyst reports in Asia, what are they talking about? And I mean, that's just one example. I mean, I think we still have a long way to go in being able to really leverage these technologies to do that, to help the reporter be more insightful so they aren't just a gatherer of facts. And I don't know, and then you get into areas of adoption. And, as you all were talking, I was thinking about technology's been changing our work as, since we started doing it. So, like, this is not, in a lot of ways, like, this is just the same as, I mean, how did digital cameras change photography? How did the use of the smartphone change journalism? And et cetera, et cetera. So in a way, it kind of feels old hat. A few things are coming to mind as I'm saying this, and I know it's a little bit rambling, but we are currently rolling out across most of AP the use of event detection tools, which you all have been using for a very long time. We're I think outside financial news, they've certainly improved significantly, and you see all these startups all around the world who are using algorithms to detect news. And, right now it's, disasters and shootings and weather events and kind of, things like that. But eventually I'm sure like that'll get, more and more sophisticated. Well, I mean, I was thinking about a couple things. One, when we tested this tool, this particular event detection algorithm with 27 journalists in AP, and we introduced it to them, we never used the words AI. I mean, we did, hey, here's like, you're using AI in your job, like, and that's the thing, like, it's just like any other technology in a way. I mean, of course, there's all sorts of implications around it, and we have to talk about it. And in fact, with event detection in particular, we've been talking about, what does it mean if journalists are now thinking about defining news according to how the algorithm alerts them to news? We have to be careful about, how we're defining that. But again, back to my point, like we didn't say, oh, hey, you are now using AI in your job.
No. I mean, look, clearly technology, if you want to go all the way back, Reuters was founded by Baron Julius von Reuter, and his big innovation was carrier pigeons. So that was a big thing. But, you're right about tools define what we can do and what we can't do, right? And increasingly AI will be the thing that defines what we can and can't do. Let me pivot a little bit to the whole notion of what feeds into AI and the quality of the data and the bias that's inherent in any piece of data, and how do we guard against that, and how do we fix that?
Yeah. So it's funny, because we were talking about this yesterday, and we were talking about some cautionary tales. You look at things like, in the US, there was a mortgage lender that took a look at the approval rates for people of color applying for mortgages, and they found that it was lower than white people. And they said, oh, it looks like our mortgage brokers, our lenders, have some unconscious bias, and we're going to build an algorithm to solve that. And the algorithm will do the first pass, and it'll be completely colorblind, and everything will be great. Well, it turns out that the algorithm they built was actually way more racist than the humans who were approving the loans. And when they looked back and they said, why? It's like, well, they fed it bad data. They trained the model on effectively biased data, and that created a biased AI. I think it was MIT that did the computer vision model, where they intentionally were teaching a computer vision model to look at Rorschach tests and analyze what they are. And one they trained on normal psychographic data, and the other they trained on Reddit. And if you've ever been on the internet, you know what Reddit is like. The one that was trained on normal data, you'd show it the little picture and it'd say, oh, that's a butterfly. The one they trained on Reddit only saw murder. They showed the picture of the butterfly and said, this is no joke, this is true. They said, it's a man being machine gunned to death in front of their children. And it's kind of insane, right? It's because they showed like what happens when you train the data. So I lob those out there as examples of what happens when we feed an algorithm bad data. So how do we overcome that? Like one is, this is where humans have a role, an important fact-checking role. Like we don't just blindly trust the algorithms to do what we think they're going to do, because they may not do what we want to do. A huge piece of this is diversity of viewpoint, diversity of contribution. Male, female, black, white, orientation, ethnic background, economic background, education level. The more viewpoints that we can provide to an AI model, the more diversity of thought we have, the more checks and balances we have, the different viewpoints we have, and we have a higher likelihood of creating an algorithm that is truly unbiased, because we've taken into account proactively how to give it data that is objective and unbiased. And that's going to be incredibly important as we start thinking about the news that then has scale to affect how potentially billions of people view the news and view current events.
Yeah, in fact, I'm just starting a book now about how women are absent from data, and how, in many large cities, the whole urban transit system, the subways and the trains and the buses are built around commuting data. But commuting data is all men,
right?
Or at least was largely men's data, and the result is that you have urban transport systems that are optimized for men but not for women. So Ben was talking about how much easier it is for people to set up an AI algorithm now to feed it training data and get a result. That means that a lot more people can do it, which is great, but it also means that a lot more people can do it, which is also an open question, because how many people will know how to do this well? I mean, you think about this from sort of a training journalist point of view and what they need to know?
I mean, we have talked about, I mean, I think really it's overdue, you know, the need for clear standards and best practices around all sorts of things, including, you know, standards for modeling in algorithms, how we disclose the use of these algorithms to our readers. And so I think, you know, it's something we definitely need to work on for not just using algorithms in reporting, but creation of automated content, you know, and all of these sorts of things.
You make a great point about transparency, which we certainly view as key on how the decisions get made and giving people the understanding of saying it's not this magic thing like, oh, you click a button and magic happens. People are becoming increasingly skeptical in today's news climate, and for good reason. Giving them the ability to understand, like, here's how we built the model. Like, they don't need to be a PhD data scientist, but architecturally, here's how we built the model, here's the data we fed it, here's how it works, here's why it works. Like, if you see things that you don't think are right, flag it for us. We want to make this thing better. We want to make it a tool that takes the journalistic integrity, the curiosity, the creativity that our team has in producing that news for you, and it speeds it, and it scales it, and it makes it better. But creating that transparency will drive trust between the journalists and the publishers and the audience that we're trying to reach.
And it's also true that what you try to optimize the data for is critical. Right? I was, you know, Minto, who was our MC last night at the awards, you know, I was sharing a cab with him, and he was talking about how, you know, he's trying to sort of encourage companies to optimize for empathy as much as for efficiency. And so, you know, but again, there's a zillion things you can optimize for on any piece of AI, and you have to choose the right ones. We've got about sort of 5-ish minutes. I thought maybe we could open it up to the floor and also turn the lights so that you guys can wake up a bit. All right, I see a waving hand, frantic in the front over there. And I can see that even with the lights blinding me. Because then your mic needs to actually work too.
Yeah, Lisa, I know it's a little time. I want to know your working flow in AP right now. Having machines working for you? Who is setting the tasks for these machines? Do they just wake up the morning and start looking for information? You are just telling them what to do? And you said they are writing, you know, they are making stories, but they have to be approved. And then later on you said they are making summaries. So are they making summaries or stories? And if I'm going to revise it before published, based on what? They have gained already some information somewhere. I don't have access to this information. Are we talking about data journalism, or if you are interested in covering this Gen Summit next one, you will be sending a machine instead of a journalist? Yes, really, it's interesting, and I want to understand.
The airfare is lower.
Thank you.
So clearly, I could talk 2 hours about all of these issues. So very quickly, when we're producing, or you know, when any of our news organizations are producing automated stories about, say, earnings reports or sports stories, journalists write templates that then the data is just run through those, and it can spit out the story automatically. So the work is done up front by the journalists in crafting the story. You know, depending on the data result, what sentence needs to be produced. You know, so that's sort of the basic automated writing. And the only thing I'll say about that is that, you know, you're confident in the story so that it can be published automatically. And the real work of the journalists at that point becomes about data maintenance, making sure that the data that is running through the template is true. And when we began automating earnings stories, we had to assign an editor to essentially update a very massive spreadsheet every month, you know, containing all that information.
What are the sources for the machine?
We are using data partners that are producing structured data about earnings, and then same for sports. We have data partners that, so humans are building structured data files based on sports scores and a variety of things. We're not using web scrapers and that, but others are. Now, I just want to say real quickly, on the automated summaries, like we've worked extensively over months. I mean, it takes thousands and thousands of examples of, you know, stories with summaries that have been written by journalists to train the algorithm what that summary is supposed to look like. And it makes mistakes, and you have to go back again and, work with it and that sort of thing. Finally, I mean, it's interesting what you say about, like, will we get to a point where we don't have to send a journalist to cover a meeting? I mean, I was talking with the CEO of Trent yesterday. AP uses Trent. We have 600 licenses in our newsroom so that our journalists can transcribe video and audio very quickly. I mean, it's a huge time savings. And we were talking about, can you use transcription, automated transcription, to essentially cover events that you aren't able to attend? So, if you're at a conference like this and there's multiple meetings going on at the same time and you're only one person, I can set up, Trent in Ben's masterclass so I can get that transcript afterwards and know everything he said. I think we will absolutely get to that point.
But you actually make a great point, which is, so what you're talking about right now, like, and this is, we can do that today. Where we have.
But Ben,
Right.
I want to ask you a slightly more complicated question.
Okay.
And small domain, how hard would it be to basically feed in a zillion sports press conferences, which are fairly standard, after game press conferences, and actually write an AI bot that would ask all the questions and get the answers? Because it's the answers are like, hey, he gave 110%. I mean, it's not like they're really complicated questions sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could, if at a high level, we could knock out a rudimentary version of that in a couple of days.
And that could ask like 60% of the questions.
Exactly. So use it, because you're absolutely right. Like, those of you who are American or follow American football, like, the league works very, very closely with players. They all say the exact same thing, right? I did this for the team. I gave 100. All I care is not the last game, it's the next game. These like usual things. Go team, right? So we can start to identify those kinds of patterns. And then you effectively create like a model that looks at certain syntax, and when they say something that's kind of this BS-y statement, you go, actually, I understand you gave 110%. What I'm really curious about is blah. So you'd start to be looking at a couple of different blocks of information. There's like the language model that effectively would be, I guess you'd call it like a BS detector, for lack of a term. That's like, I understand how people say things, and then it algorithmically understands.
Please create the BS detector bot immediately.
It's going to be big. We'll work on it. Next year when you're monitoring the panel, I will have a demo of the BS detector.
Excellent.
But then you also have to take a look at using tools to parse through all of the current and archival video to understand what type of plays, what happened with that player specifically, so you could actually map a conversation tree against those individual things.
Okay,
Let's
we
have
got
the
30
last
seconds.
question.
One question.
Briefly, this is a general comment. One of you touched on AI. The previous session was also on AI. I'm just a thought here. Have you thought of when overdoing of AI could lead to fake news? And also the danger is that when journalists resort to fake news, it could also lead to a situation where even when they write the truth, it may not be believed.
Look, I think clearly, there are huge risks around using AI to not just write fake news. I mean, there's deep fakes and so on, but simply, frankly, just turning stories to match somebody's predisposition, right? So you could write the left-wing story or the right-wing story, exactly the same facts. That's probably more insidious than actually sort of creating something completely from scratch. I think our time is up. Want to get a 5-second summary, and then we'll get off the stage? No?
Well, all I'll say is, sort of to the last point, this technology is going to allow us to do amazing things. Just because we can doesn't mean we should and will. Anything we do has to still fit into the news values and principles of the organization, and I think we're all committed to that.
And I think from my side, I would say really quickly, AI is always going to be, from our perspective, a tool that augments the creativity, ingenuity, and curiosity of a human reporter. It's going to be something that can speed, it's going to be something that can scale and increase the scope, but it's not going to be something that's going to replace.
All right. See you all next year when we talk about blockchain.
Thank you. I'm sure you want to keep going.